The rain began as a thin whisper against the roof as Ethan Hale stood outside the door he had not entered in years, his coat damp, his chest tight, his breath uneven, the house before him glowing softly like it still remembered him. And when he finally stepped inside, the warmth wrapped around him in a way that almost made him turn back because it felt undeserved after all this time. The hallway was narrow, familiar, lined with old photos that showed a boy growing into a man who once believed the world was simple. And at the end of it, his mother Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling between her hands, her hair now more silver than he remembered, her eyes still sharp enough to notice that something was wrong the moment she looked up, because Ethan did not smile, did not speak, did not even meet her gaze right away, and the silence that followed his arrival stretched longer than comfort allowed, filled only by the ticking clock and the quiet sound of rain. And Margaret rose slowly, careful not to startle him, her movements gentle as if he were something fragile that might break if touched too suddenly. And she asked if he was hungry, if the drive was long, if the rain followed him all the way here. But he only shook his head and sat down across from her, placing his hands flat on the table like he needed to anchor himself to something solid. And she noticed the small tremor in his fingers and felt a familiar ache settle in her chest, the kind that came when a mother knew her child was hurting but did not yet know why. Ethan looked around the kitchen, taking in the chipped paint, the old curtains, the window that always stuck halfway open. And for a brief moment he was 12 again, asking for advice, asking for help, believing answers would come easily. But this time his throat tightened and words refused to line up, because what he had come to say did not fit neatly into the past or the present. And Margaret waited, patient, silent, letting the moment breathe, knowing pressure would only push him further away. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, as if unused. And he said he needed to ask her something important, something he had carried with him through sleepless nights and long empty mornings, something he was afraid to say out loud because once spoken it could not be taken back. The room seemed to grow smaller as Margaret leaned forward, her hands folded, her face open but serious, and Ethan felt the weight of her attention like a light revealing everything he had tried to hide, his failures, his regrets, the quiet loneliness that followed him even when surrounded by people. And he swallowed hard, remembering the years that passed too fast, the choices made for safety instead of truth, the love he once had that slipped through his fingers because he believed letting go was the brave thing to do. And as the rain outside grew heavier, he felt the past press closer, urging him forward, urging him to speak. And Margaret's eyes softened when she saw his shoulders slump, when she recognized that look she had seen only once before, the night his father left, when Ethan learned that love could disappear without warning. Ethan drew a slow breath and told her he had not come for food or rest or even comfort, not in the usual sense, but because he stood at a crossroad and did not trust himself to choose the right path alone. And as he spoke, his words came faster, spilling out in a rush, about the life he built that never felt like his own, about the job that paid well but drained him, about waking up every day with the sense that something essential was missing. And Margaret listened without interruption, her heart tightening with each sentence, realizing how little she truly knew about the man her son had become. And when he paused, she reached across the table, stopping just short of touching his hand, giving him the choice, and he took it, his fingers closing around hers, with quiet desperation, grounding himself in the simple fact that she was there, that she had always been there. And he finally said that someone from his past had returned, not suddenly but inevitably, like a memory refusing to stay buried. And though he did not say the name, yet Margaret understood enough to feel the shift, to sense that this was not just a story of regret but of longing, of unfinished emotion that time had failed to erase. And Ethan confessed that he had spent years convincing himself that moving on meant forgetting, that building a stable life meant leaving behind the parts of himself that felt too deeply. But now those parts were awake again, restless, demanding to be heard. And he admitted that fear had followed him back to this house, fear of being wrong, fear of reopening wounds, fear of hoping for something that might never be returned. And Margaret saw not the grown man before her, but the boy who once asked if loving someone always meant risking pain. And she remembered how she had answered then, carefully, honestly, telling him that pain was the cost of feeling alive. And now that lesson returned to her with new weight. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, noticing the lines on her face that told stories of sacrifice and quiet strength. and his voice softened as he said that he needed her help. Not to fix anything, not to decide for him, but simply to stand beside him while he faced something he had avoided for too long. And though he had not yet said what that something was, Margaret understood that the request would not be small, that it would ask something of her too, something emotional, something tied to her own past losses. And the clock continued to tick, steady and indifferent, while outside the rain washed the world clean, and inside the kitchen 2 lives hovered at the edge of change, neither yet aware of how deeply the next words would alter the shape of what came next. Ethan did not rush into the truth, but once he started he did not slow down either, as if stopping would make him lose the nerve to continue, and he told his mother that a letter arrived 3 days ago, slipped under his apartment door like a ghost from another life, written in handwriting he recognized instantly even though years had passed. And the moment he saw the name his chest tightened and his hands went cold. Because some names never lose their power no matter how long you try to forget them. And he admitted that he stood there for a long time staring at the envelope, afraid that opening it would undo the careful balance he had built, a balance that looked fine from the outside but felt hollow inside. And when he finally opened it he felt like the ground shifted under him. Because the words inside were simple, honest and painfully familiar, saying that she was back in town, that life had taken turns she never expected, and that she often thought of him not with regret but with quiet warmth. And Ethan told Margaret that reading those words made his heart race in a way it had not in years, reminding him of who he was before. Fear taught him to choose safety over truth. He told her about Lena without drama or exaggeration, just facts shaped by feeling. How they met when they were young and unsure. How loving her felt natural and deep. How she saw parts of him no one else noticed. And how he walked away not because he stopped loving her, but because he believed love alone was not enough to survive adulthood. And as he spoke Margaret felt the weight of his honesty, realizing this was not a story he had ever shared. Fully not with friends, not with himself. And Ethan said that seeing Lena's words reopened questions he buried long ago. Questions about whether he chose the right life or simply the easiest one. Whether stability without passion was truly peace or just quiet loneliness. And he admitted that since the letter arrived he had not slept well. His mind running through memories and imagined futures. Every path filled with risk, every choice carrying consequence. He looked at Margaret then, his eyes searching her face for judgment or comfort. And he said that Lena asked to meet. Not to demand anything, not to promise anything, just to talk, and that scared him more than anger ever could, because calm honesty left no place to hide, and Margaret listened, her heart heavy but steady, understanding more than he realized, because she too once stood at a crossroad where love and fear pulled in opposite directions, and she recognized the same tension in her son's voice, the same careful self-control cracking under emotion. Ethan continued, saying that what haunted him most was not the possibility of rejection but the thought of not trying, of walking away again and carrying that weight into the rest of his life. And he said that for the first time he realized he had been living cautiously, avoiding strong feelings because they demanded courage, and now courage was exactly what he lacked, and that was why he came home, not for permission but for strength, because growing up he believed his mother was the strongest person he knew, and even now her presence made the world feel more manageable. Margaret felt tears gather but she did not let them fall, because this moment was about him, and she asked him quietly what he wanted from her, and Ethan hesitated before answering, his voice softer now, almost uncertain, as he said he wanted her to come with him when he met Lena, not to speak for him, not to intervene, but simply to be there, nearby, as proof that he was not facing the past alone, and the request hung in the air heavier than anything he had said so far, because it asked Margaret to step into a moment shaped by emotion and history, and she felt surprise rise first, followed by concern, because she knew how fragile such reunions could be, how hope could hurt as much as it healed. Ethan rushed on, afraid she might refuse, explaining that he did not trust himself yet, that seeing Lena again might shake him more than he was ready for, and that knowing his mother was close would steady him, the way her presence always did when life felt too big. And Margaret studied him, seeing the conflict written clearly across his face, the desire to move forward fighting the fear of falling apart, and she realized this was not about dependency but transition, a moment where a son still needed his mother not to lead him but to walk beside him as he learned how to stand on his own. She asked him what he hoped would happen, and Ethan answered honestly that he did not know, That part of him hoped for closure while another part quietly hoped for something more. Something unfinished to begin again, and Margaret nodded, because uncertainty was not weakness but truth, and she told him that love rarely followed clear paths, that even the wrong choices taught something valuable, and Ethan listened carefully, absorbing every word like it mattered deeply, because it did. The rain outside softened, turning into a steady rhythm that filled the pauses between sentences, and Margaret asked him if he was ready for whatever answer might come, ready to accept that Lena might have changed, that time might have built distance no apology could bridge, and Ethan said he was afraid but willing, that fear no longer felt like a reason to stay still, and in that moment Margaret saw something shift in him, a quiet determination forming beneath the uncertainty, and she understood that refusing his request would mean asking him to face that moment alone, something she could not bring herself to do. Still, she took her time responding, because she knew her agreement would carry meaning. Beyond that single meeting, it would signal trust in his judgment and respect for his journey, and as she thought she remembered her own past, the choices she made, the love she lost, and the nights she wondered what might have been if she had been braver, and she realized that helping her son face his past was also a way of honoring her own, and when she finally spoke her voice was calm but firm, telling him that she would go with him, that she would wait nearby and give him space, but that she would not let him walk away from something important without knowing he was supported. And relief washed over Ethan's face so clearly that Margaret felt her heart ache, because sometimes strength came not from independence but from shared courage, and as they sat there together the request no longer felt shocking but necessary, a step toward honesty, growth, and whatever future waited beyond that door neither of them had opened yet. Margaret barely slept that night because once Ethan went to bed the house felt too quiet and her thoughts too loud, and she lay staring at the ceiling replaying his words, his tone, the look in his eyes when he asked her to stand beside him, and she realized the request was not sudden at all but the result of years of silence finally breaking. And as the clock moved toward morning she thought about her own past, about the moments where fear guided her choices instead of truth, and how those choices shaped the life she lived, steady but marked by quiet sacrifice, and she wondered if helping Ethan face his past was also a way to heal a small part of her own. When the sun rose she was already awake, dressed and calm, having reached a decision that felt both heavy and right, and when Ethan came into the kitchen she saw the tension return to his shoulders, the question in his eyes before he even spoke, and she simply nodded and told him she was ready, and relief crossed his face so quickly it almost hurt to see, because it showed how much he needed this support, how close he had been to turning back. They drove together through streets that felt unchanged yet distant, the town moving past the window like a memory half remembered, and neither spoke much because words felt unnecessary, replaced by the shared understanding that something important waited ahead, and Margaret watched Ethan from the corner of her eye, noticing how his jaw tightened, how his hands gripped the wheel, how he slowed as they neared the cafe Lena had chosen, and when they parked he sat still for a moment, breathing carefully, gathering himself, and Margaret placed her hand on his arm, steady and warm, telling him without words that he could do this. They stepped out into the cool air, the sound of distant traffic mixing with the low hum of the town, and as they walked toward the cafe Ethan's steps faltered, memories rising with each block, and Margaret stayed close but did not crowd him, giving him space while remaining present, the balance she had learned over years of motherhood. Outside the cafe the windows were fogged slightly, hiding the moment. Inside, and Ethan stopped, his face pale, and Margaret could feel the weight of his hesitation, the pull between past and present tightening around him, and she spoke softly, reminding him that whatever happened inside did not define his worth, that facing it was already an act of courage, and he nodded, drawing strength from her calm certainty. When they entered the cafe the smell of coffee and warm bread filled the air, and time seemed to slow as Ethan scanned the room until his eyes found Lena sitting near the window, her posture familiar yet changed, her presence steady and real, and for a second he looked like he might turn back, but Margaret gently squeezed his hand and whispered that she would wait outside, giving him the space this moment deserved, and he hesitated before letting go, a small pause that held years of trust and love, then nodded and walked toward Lena alone. Margaret stepped back out onto the street and sat on a nearby bench, her heart racing despite her calm expression because waiting was sometimes harder than acting, and she stared at the cafe door, thinking about how fragile this moment was, how easily it could break either way, and she wondered what Ethan would find inside, closure, renewal, or simply understanding, and she knew she could not protect him from the outcome, only from facing it alone. Inside, Ethan approached the table slowly and Lena looked up, surprise flashing across her face before softening into something warmer and more complex, and they greeted each other with awkward politeness that quickly gave way to honesty, sitting down as if the years between them were both distant and present at once, and Ethan felt his nerves settle slightly as they began to talk, not rushing, not hiding, letting the conversation find its own pace. They spoke about small things first, work, the town, mutual friends, but beneath every word ran the current of what remained unsaid. And when Lena finally met his eyes and said she was glad he came, something loosened inside him, and he realized how much he had feared this simple acceptance. Outside, Margaret watched the minutes pass, measuring time by the people who walked by the shifting light, by the steady rhythm of her own breathing, and she reflected on how letting go did not mean stepping away completely but trusting the strength she helped build. And she hoped Ethan felt that strength now. Inside, the conversation deepened as Ethan and Lena spoke honestly about the past, about why they ended, about the choices they made believing they were necessary, and though regret surfaced, it did not dominate the space, replaced instead by understanding and growth, and Ethan realized that both of them had changed, not into strangers but into people shaped by time and experience, and that realization eased some of his fear. Margaret sensed when the tension shifted, when the moment turned from fragile to steady, and she felt a quiet pride rise in her chest, knowing Ethan was facing this with openness rather than avoidance. And she understood then that her role was nearly complete, that she had given him what he needed most, the courage to begin. After a long while the cafe door opened and Ethan stepped outside, his expression unreadable at first, and Margaret rose immediately, searching his face for signs of pain or relief, and when he met her eyes she saw both, mixed together, honest and raw, and he sat beside her, exhaling deeply, and told her it went well, not perfect, not resolved but real, and that was enough for now. Margaret listened as he shared pieces of the conversation, careful not to interrupt, letting him process the moment out loud, and she could hear the change in his voice, lighter yet thoughtful, as if a weight had shifted even if it had not fully lifted, and she knew this was the beginning of something rather than the end. As they walked back to the car together the town felt different, less heavy, and Ethan moved with more confidence, his steps steady, and Margaret realized that helping him face this moment had also brought her peace, because watching her son choose honesty over fear felt like watching a cycle break, and though uncertainty still waited ahead, it no longer felt paralyzing. And as they drove home in comfortable silence she understood that some decisions did not need clear outcomes to be right. They only needed courage, support, and the willingness to face what had been avoided for too long. The sky had cleared by the time Ethan and Margaret reached the park near the cafe, the clouds pulling apart to let late sunlight spill across the empty benches and wet paths, and Ethan walked slower now, as if his body needed time to catch up with everything his heart had just faced. And when they sat down he stared ahead for a moment before speaking, letting the quiet settle, because for the first time in years the silence did not feel heavy but open, full of possibility. And he told his mother that seeing Lena again did not break him the way he feared but also did not fix everything the way part of him secretly hoped. Instead it did something more honest. It reminded him that love could change shape without disappearing, that feelings could remain even when people grew apart, and Margaret listened closely, her posture relaxed, her attention complete, knowing this was a moment that would live in her memory long after the words faded. Ethan said that Lena spoke with calm clarity, not blaming him, not asking for promises, simply sharing how life had unfolded for her, the lessons she learned, the way she had grown stronger. And hearing that made him realize how much time had passed and how little time truly erased. And when she admitted that she still cared for him but had learned not to cling to the past, he felt both relief and sadness, because it meant the door was not locked but it was no longer wide open either. Margaret nodded, understanding that this space between certainty and loss was where real life often lived, and she asked him how he felt now, and Ethan answered honestly that he felt lighter, not because everything was solved but because he finally faced what he had avoided, and that courage changed him more than the outcome ever could. As they sat there, Ethan reflected on the moment inside the cafe when he realized he was no longer the same man who once walked away. He was older, steadier, more aware of his fears, and that awareness gave him power instead of weakness, and Margaret felt pride rise quietly inside her, because she saw not just her son but a man choosing growth even when the path was unclear. Ethan then admitted something he had not said before, that part of his request was rooted in fear of being alone, Fear that if he failed again he would have no one to turn to, and Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, telling him that love did not disappear just because one chapter ended, that family remained steady and real, even when romance felt uncertain, and those words grounded him more deeply than anything else that day. They stood and began walking toward the car as the light shifted, and Ethan noticed how the town felt different. Now, not because it changed but because he had, and he realized that returning here was not about revisiting the past but reclaiming a part of himself he left behind, and Margaret walked beside him, matching his pace, content in the quiet knowledge that her presence had mattered. On the drive home Ethan spoke about what came next, not with big plans or promises but with openness, saying he wanted to slow down, reassess his life, question the choices he made out of habit rather than intention. And Margaret encouraged him without pushing, reminding him that clarity came through action and patience, not pressure, and that he did not need to decide everything at once. When they arrived back at the house the evening felt gentle, the kind that invited reflection rather than urgency, and Margaret made tea while Ethan sat at the table, watching her movements, realizing how many times in his life this simple scene brought him comfort, and he thanked her quietly, not just for coming with him, but for trusting him, for letting him face something difficult without judgment, and Margaret smiled, telling him that being his mother did not end when he grew up, it simply changed shape. Later that night Ethan sat alone in his old room, looking out the window as the stars emerged one by one, and he thought about Lena, about the possibility of seeing her again, about the slow rebuilding of trust if they chose that path, but he also thought about himself, about becoming someone who no longer ran from feeling deeply, and for the first time that idea felt less frightening and more necessary. Margaret in her room reflected on the day with a quiet fullness, knowing she had helped her son step forward rather than stay stuck, and she accepted that letting go did not mean losing connection, it meant allowing growth, and that realization brought her peace. In the days that followed Ethan did meet Lena again, slowly, carefully, with honesty rather than expectation. And while the future between them remained uncertain, it felt real, shaped by choice rather than fear, and Margaret watched from a respectful distance, offering support without control, trusting the strength her son continued to build. Over time Ethan changed small things in his life, speaking more honestly, listening more deeply, allowing himself to feel joy and disappointment without shutting down, and each step forward traced back to that moment when he chose courage over comfort, and when Margaret chose to stand beside him rather than protect him from risk. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, Ethan returned to the same park and sat on the same bench, alone this time, reflecting on how far he had come, and he smiled, because he understood now that the request he made that rainy day was not about the past or even about love. It was about learning how to face life fully, and in doing so he found a deeper connection not only with Lena but with himself and with his mother, whose steady presence taught him that growth was not a lonely journey but a shared one, shaped by trust, courage, and the quiet strength of choosing to move forward.